This conference will now be recorded.
Hey, so good morning again, everyone. Thank you for coming to this month's Chamber Council on Nonprofits. This is the second in the nonprofit series sponsored by the Gadsden Public Library. So thank you so much to the director, Craig Scott, who's with us today on camera, for sponsoring this series and joining us again today. We really appreciate their support and also appreciate Knowles and Sullivan for speaking on today's topic about some of the ABCs of legal advice for nonprofits when starting a nonprofit, and also pitfalls to avoid. But before we get started, Craig, if you want to unmute yourself and say a few words.
There we go. Very good. There, thanks, Will, for the quick little introduction. And the library is very excited this year to sponsor the nonprofit council. We had a great session back in January with Ruth Moffett with United Way, and looking forward today to having Christy Knowles, but Christy had a prior engagement that came up. She'll be at City Council, which is meeting right now. So in her place, very pleased to have Megan from the firm join us, and Megan will be up in a minute here. And then September 7th is our next nonprofit council, and we're very pleased to tell everyone that Tina King will be joining us as our guest speaker for that. So the library, founded way back in 1906, so this is our 115th year, one of Gadsden's oldest businesses. Come on over to see the library, especially on a rainy day like this. The library is the downtown shelter, so I already had to call in this morning to EMA to say, yep, the library is open and we're ready, and we've already got 2 people in our basement that were afraid and wanted to come to a safer place. So library is a downtown shelter. But last thing I want to mention is library cards. If you don't have a library card, stop by, but especially for kids, your grandkids out there too. It's a prized possession. So give the kids a thrill if they don't have their library card yet. We serve Gadsden and Etowah County, so stop in. With that.
Craig, thank you so much. So Meg, if you want to take it over.
So as Craig already mentioned, I kind of took this over from Christy because she had something else going on. Knowles and Sullivan, we do a lot of business law. We handle quite a few nonprofits, nonprofit formation. And so I wanted to kind of focus on how to become a nonprofit, what it means to be a nonprofit, and why you might be interested in becoming a nonprofit if you were previously just a group of like-minded individuals trying to help the community. So nonprofits are something that are particularly important to me because I tend to get very involved with animal-based nonprofits. At the moment, I am a invested volunteer with Friends of Rescue, which is a nonprofit in North Alabama focusing on adoptable shelter animals. Murphy, that you can see in the picture here, he was in my wedding. He comes to work with me at Knowles and Sullivan, if you ever want to come meet him. He was adopted through Friends of Rescue from Marshall County Animal Shelter. So 2 nonprofits that worked together to get me my best friend and best man. As you can see from the quote, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing gets better. It's not. And that's one of the really cool things about nonprofits is it allows you to care about something. And no 2 nonprofits are the same because they're a group of like-minded individuals who care about something a whole awful lot. So for me, it's rescue animals. It's especially disabled rescue animals. You can't really tell from the picture, but Murphy has 3 legs. So between Friends of Rescue and Wags to Riches, which is a group of professional or semi-professional photographers taking pictures of adoptable animals to help them get better or forever homes, I've found my niche, but my niche might not be your niche. And that's why you might be interested in creating a nonprofit with you and people who care about things like you. So I've got a handout today that includes the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. That it's got a rather huge chart of different forms of nonprofits and things that you can fall under. So there's a whole little box that says animal related, and that's where I fit in, but they've got mental health, where if you care a lot about addiction, substance abuse, you could form a nonprofit that cares about that. They have education, legal related nonprofits, things like the Legal Services of Alabama. That's a 501c3 nonprofit organization for attorneys who are focused on providing civil legal services to people who couldn't otherwise afford it. Human services, recreation, sports, leisure, food, agriculture, civil rights, children's advocacy, really anything that goes towards the social or public benefit. And we'll get to what that means more in depth here in a minute. So the first kind of misnomer that I want to address is the term nonprofit. So just because you are a nonprofit does not mean you can't make a profit. What it means is you can't distribute this profit to a private individual, although you could pay someone for their services. So a lot of the time when you think of nonprofits, you think, oh, well, you can't make money if you're a nonprofit. Well, you can make money for the purpose that you created your nonprofit. So the term nonprofit, it's a misnomer, but it's the one that made the most sense when trying to name a 501c3 tax code in something that people could understand. So a nonprofit is a legal entity organized and operated for a collective, public, or social benefit. The tax code allows for 501 is the tax exempt portion of the code. I mean, you've got things like chambers of commerce, boards, school boards. I mean, there's different sections under the 501, but 501c3 specifically goes towards public charities and private foundations. So if you're thinking about creating a nonprofit, your first step is always going to be reserving your name with the Secretary of State's office. It costs $27-ish, depending on if you do it by mail or online, if you use a card, if you pay by check. You're going to want to go onto the Secretary of State's website and do a business entity search just to see if your name is already reserved or if it's already taken, and then send in your name reservation. It will reserve it for exactly 1 year. And so you have 1 year from the time you reserve your name to begin the process of actually creating your nonprofit. And we have a handout today that has all of these forms or examples of these forms. So we're going to upload it later if you're online, or if you're here, we have copies. That's the easy part. Step one, just decide what your name is. The next part is going to be a little more difficult. It's your certificate of formation. We have a form for that as well. It's called a domestic nonprofit corporation certificate of formation form. You can get it off of the Secretary of State's website, or like I said, we've got one here. It can either be done online or by mail. How much this will cost kind of depends on your expected revenues. Typically, the full formation process is going to be, if you're a smaller nonprofit making less than $50,000 or having less than $75,000 in assets, it's $220-ish. Again, that depends on if you do it online or if you do it by mail, if you use a card, if you pay by check. But that certificate of formation is going to include things like your name, what county you're going to be organized in, what are you going to be focused on. Then you need to create your bylaws. The bylaws are unique to each individual organization. So for an animal rescue bylaws, you're going to need to focus on, which shelters you pull from, how you vet your animals. For a mental health nonprofit, you're going to need to focus on how you're going to provide mental health services. So the bylaws are going to be specific to your organization to some extent, but they're also going to need to do things like create a hierarchy of leadership. They're going to need to have your methodology for action. You're going to need to create a methodology for amendment. If you ever wanted to change the rules, you need to create a way to do that in your bylaws. You're also going to want to have your first meeting's minutes, because this is the meeting where you decide to be a nonprofit. So you need to memorialize that. You need to write it down. At this first meeting, you can also do things like decide on who your leaders are, create an officer position, elect someone to that officer position, because you're going to need a board or a leadership person when you're filing these documents to act as the registered agent or to act as the point of contact when you're filing all of these documents. So step 3, you're going to need to do this after you make those bylaws, officers type decisions, because in your charitable organization registration, you're going to need to include things like your fiscal year, which is something you have to decide at that first meeting. When do you want your fiscal year to begin? When do you want it to end? You're also going to need to include things like what type of charitable organization you are, what county you're being formed in. There's also, I've included a copy of the charitable organization registration in the packet, but really it's best to do that online. So even what I've included is a printout of the online form, but I printed it out so that everyone can see kind of what information you're going to need to have, because you might want to have this charitable organization registration with you when you do that first meeting, so you know to prepare for what you're going to have to fill out later. So you can go ahead and kind of ask those questions, get that established with your officers and your board. So after those 3 steps, we kind of hand things off to the accountants. I'm not an accountant. I don't want to be. I don't pretend to be. So a lot of the next couple steps, we'll talk a little bit about the 1023 when we get there in the slideshow, but from here, you're going to need to establish a relationship with an accountant who will then become your best friend, who will help you keep up with the money, who will help you file your tax returns at the end of the year. But from an attorney's perspective, now that you've become a nonprofit, you now have the ability to collect funds for the purpose of your nonprofit. So you can solicit charitable donations, which is something you couldn't do before you created this nonprofit entity. But there's a lot of strings that come with money, as we all know, and charitable fraud is a crime. It falls under Title 13A, which is the criminal code. So when you collect money, you just need to be careful and make sure that you're doing it in the right way for the right reasons, and the money goes to where you say it's going to go. I know we don't all wake up today and decide to commit charitable fraud, but it's something that you can, I won't say you could do on accident, but it's something that could happen if we're not paying attention and being very careful with your money. So I've included, like I said in the packet, a copy of the criminal code that addresses charitable fraud, just so that you can kind of have that in the back of your mind. These are things we need to pay attention to. And I've included the definition of charitable fraud here. So theft of property by charitable fraud occurs when a professional fundraiser or solicitor knowingly represents that he or she is soliciting funds for a charitable organization without the organization's consent, or receives any contributions which are not delivered to the charitable organization either within 30 days of receipt or within 10 days of the request by the organization, whichever is sooner. So if you're collecting money for your organization, give the money to the organization within a timely period. The code says 30 days or 10 days of the request, but just be responsible with your money and this won't happen to you. Next, we're going to get kind of into the tax stuff, which, like I said, is not my forte, but I can tell you to get an accountant. So a CPA, it's always best to hire a CPA or a tax professional to handle your nonprofit's tax filings. If you create this relationship really early in the process, so create the relationship with the CPA as you're filing these formation documents, get them in on the ground floor and they'll be with you for life. You have to file a 1023-EZ within a certain period of filing your formation documents. Whether it's an EZ or a full 1023 is going to depend on how much money your nonprofit makes, and that's kind of depending on, you know, what are your goals for your nonprofit, what do you realistically think that you can accomplish. Communicate with your accountant, like I said, from the ground floor, because they're there to help you. I mean, you're hiring a professional who knows what they're doing. So just make sure that your treasurer or whoever handles the money for your organization has the contact for your CPA and that they are able to talk to the CPA whenever they need to in order to keep the organization above ground and make sure that everything is good to go. Another big thing, especially from your attorney, is going to be make sure that your files are accurate and up to date. Just keep a record of everything, write receipts, know where the money came from and where it went. And that goes for all of your filings. And then finally, I kind of want to talk about some myths that I've heard recently about nonprofits. So nonprofits can have paid staff. I know you think of nonprofits, you think of volunteers, but if your nonprofit is large enough that you're able to pay your staff a reasonable salary for their services, you're allowed to do that. In like the stat says here, in 2016, 10% of the private workforce in the United States worked for nonprofits. In that sense, you think of places like the United Way, the American Red Cross, these huge nonprofits that have, offices state to state, and those offices have to be staffed by someone. Another myth that I've heard recently is that most nonprofits are large and have huge resources. You do think of the American Red Cross, or you think of United Way, or I think of Legal Services because they're a huge entity in my mind. But that's not necessarily true. In 2016, 92% of all reporting public charities had revenues of under 1 million. So just because you're small doesn't mean you're not useful, and it doesn't mean you're not accomplishing something, especially if your goal is to focus on a small area. So if your goal is to focus on helping people of Etowah County, Alabama, then being small is okay because you're serving a small area, and a small area that has a great need. I believe that's the end of the presentation that I had pre-prepared. Like I said, there's a handout that we'll get out to everyone that has the forms for all of these steps. It has the tax code, it has the criminal code, if you had any questions about that. It also has this fun little chart that I like that shows all the things that your nonprofit could care about, because I just love seeing how diverse a nonprofit can be. And it also includes some of the tax filings and how to get to the tax filings on pay.gov if that's an endeavor that you would wish to take upon yourself. I hate math, so I can't help with that part. But if anybody has any questions on the formation documents or on what it means to be a nonprofit or even the criminal code, I'm happy to answer.
I have questions on formation, but do you have tips on like pitfalls, things that you see of existing nonprofits?
Sure.
That problems that people get into?
The biggest one is keeping up with your files, honestly, because it becomes such a mess when you're trying to remember, oh, what did I do with that $100 so-and-so gave me in January? And at this point, it's October, and who knows? Like, I don't remember what I did last January, but keeping an organized way to document everything and making sure that that documentation is universal among the nonprofit. So some of the nonprofits that I'm a member of, we use Google Docs because you can have multiple people going in and editing. So you could have, all of your board members can go in and add to that spreadsheet. I received this many dollars from this person. Or if everyone is going to use the same filing cabinet in this room and this building, then that's fine. Just make sure that everyone is using the same filing cabinet in this room in this building, because when you have multiple people in an organization, now you have multiple hands dealing with it, and it's hard, for the right hand to know what the left hand is doing. So I just cannot stress enough having a uniform system for keeping up with your files, keeping up with your receipts, your documentation, with any donations that you've received, because to me, that's the biggest pitfall, is organization, because you're dealing with multiple people. So it's hard. I know that I am organized to a T, but I don't know that, Billy Bob, my nonprofit friend, is organized to a T. So we just need to make sure that if one person is handling the money all the time, that's great. Just make sure that everyone knows one person is handling the money all the time. And if multiple people are handling it, they just need to all have the same system. Another big issue that I've found is nonprofits being afraid of going, I mean, especially with new nonprofits. So you tell someone, hey, you're a nonprofit now, go do nonprofit-y things. And there's this initial trepidation, like, do I really get to go forth and be? Should I not? Do I need to tell people I'm a nonprofit? And, you know, once you do these steps, once you file everything, once you get your 1023 in, you're real, you're legit, go forth and do. But there's that initial fear that it's an understandable fear because you just did a big thing. You created a nonprofit organization. And so the first couple years, I have a lot of, clients that have anxiety about, is it okay? Do I have permission? Like, yes, this piece of paper gave you permission as long as you're following the rules. Those are the two biggest ones that I can think of off the top of my head. Just paperwork, and don't be afraid, because I mean, you created this nonprofit because you cared about something, right? So it's okay to care. You're supposed to care. The IRS gave you permission to care. Thank you. That was a good question.
You mentioned the Form 1023, and I know we have to do a Form 990.
Different forms for different organizations, and that's accountant questions. I know the initial formation, because you don't have any money, because you're a new organization, the 1023 is almost always appropriate, but that's always a question for the accountant. And depending on what type of nonprofit you are, we'll change it a little bit. I defer to my CPA friends on that one.
So circling back to the types of nonprofits, talk about from the state.
Sure. Both. If you're going to create a nonprofit, you need to have a stated purpose. So if you wanted a general nonprofit to just do good things in general, there is an option for that. So if you're thinking, oh, I may want to branch out and do more things, be very general, because once you pick a specific purpose, then you are required to stick to your specific purpose. Now, you could go back and try to amend those documents to change your purpose down the road if you think, oh, I'm going to use the dog example every time because that's who I am as a person. But if you created a nonprofit for just rescue animals and then down the road you decided, I really want to focus on cats with 3 legs, you can do that as long as it fits within your stated purpose. And if it doesn't fit within your stated purpose, you will need to amend that or change it, go back and amend your bylaws through whatever mechanism you've allowed yourself. You just need to make sure that what you're doing lines up with what you told the IRS you were doing. So if you think you may want to do all the things that involve this general topic, pick a general organization. Don't pick a super specific narrow niche if you think you're going to want to branch out of it. Yeah.
Talk about the sort of tax exemption allowances for nonprofits, and what are the responsibilities and rules there?
Yeah, so nonprofits pay less to none in taxes. You may still have to pay some taxes depending on how much you made or what type of nonprofit you are. As far as the specifics, I'm going to defer to my CPA friends. Yeah, it's not an all the time blanket exemption. See, nonprofit, and that's another myth that I feel like I maybe should have addressed, that it doesn't mean you'll never pay taxes. It means you could pay significantly less, or you may never pay taxes on certain things. May be completely exempt from property tax, but not exempt from sales tax, depending on what type of nonprofit you are and what state you're in. Alabama, state exemption versus Texas state exemption are going to be completely different. So for that, I'm going to defer to my CPA friends.
Someone is getting into it, to overcome that fear of getting going and getting out and doing things.
Yeah, that's the hardest one. Honestly, it is. And my best advice is just to, so for my sister is in the process of forming a nonprofit with her photography group, taking pictures of shelter animals. And my advice to her was to frame your formation. And so if you ever think, maybe I shouldn't, look at your formation document and tell yourself I should, because the government told me I can. And just remember, why even become a nonprofit if you're not going to go out and do the things that you set out to do? So I guess just when you have that moment of fear, think back to why you're here and overcome. And I know that's easier said than done, but it's a fear that I feel like everyone has when they're starting out, when they're new. Anything else from the?
Yeah, so if anyone on the call has any questions, at all, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. Put it in the chat function. I posted a chat a few minutes ago asking you guys to submit some questions. So if you have anything, we'll give it a couple seconds to submit something, and if not, we'll wrap it up. All right, well, I don't see any more questions in the chat or here in the room. So if you guys have any questions at all, you can always email me. Feel free to, I'll be happy to pass them on to Meg. As we mentioned earlier, the handouts she had, I'll be getting those from her and scanning those in and sending them to everyone who registered as a PDF, so you can check those out if you'd like to. But that wraps it up for this month's Chamber Council then. Craig, thank you so much to the library for sponsoring this series. And Meg, thank you for joining us from Knowles and Sullivan and speaking today. Y'all have a safe week and stay dry today and be weather aware. Take care, and we'll see you later on.